I always like English frames. I have a soft spot in that marriage that you make between painting and frame, and there's that sort of serendipitous selection that they almost choose each other. It's like a dating agency in a sense. And so I knew there was a Bonnard in this rather flat frame with a beveled sight edge in pine, and I thought, this is a Bonnard frame, and I have a frame like this. So I offered it to him, and he very politely came back and said, "Michael, thank you very much, sir, but when I want a floorboard, I will go to a local timber yard."
Welcome to Colnaghi Talks. Welcome everyone. We're here at Wiggins, just around the corner from Colnaghi, and I'm here with Michael Gregory, director of Wiggins. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
And I'm here with my colleague Mary Gringle. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's get started with the first question about Wiggins' history and its identity today. Of course, Wiggins has a great place in London's art ecosystem. It's a partner with dealers, auction houses, museums, institutions. And I want to ask you, Michael, how would you describe the identity of Wiggins today, especially looking back at its history?
Interesting for me to now, at this point in my career, in a way, to sit and reflect, because maybe I didn't do that. You're always sort of trying to go forwards. But I think I've been at Wiggins a long time, and I came into the business as a craftsman. I finished art school at City and Guilds, which is a little shout out for City and Guilds Art School, which still trains carvers and gilders and consolation. And I joined Wiggins as a woodcarver, working at the bench with Jim Wiggins. And I think the identity then would have been craftsman dealers. So I think the Wiggins family would have said that. They were carvers and gilders and craftsmen. But they bought frames and they sold frames. And they made frames as well. But they had this big stock of antique frames. So I think I continued that tradition. I think I wanted to continue that tradition, and starting from the bench and then, running the workshop. I think I saw myself as a continuation of this, and I think I still really identify like that now, and Wiggins still maintains that identity. We don't have a big workshop. Things change around us, so I guess Wiggins has changed and faced the market, so we've reorientated a bit, but I think the essence is still there as craftsmen, dealers, knowledge about the objects. We try and understand the pictures and the art market as well, of course, but craftsmen, dealers, I think, so I think quite consistent, I think, in a way.
Yeah. And about the history of Wiggins and how it's, changed and evolved, there is a moment in Wiggins' history that's particularly tied to Colnaghi, and it was close with Colnaghi, and I think it was under Jacob Rothschild ownership that Wiggins became a part of the Colnaghi group. What can you tell us about that time and that relationship?
Well, yes, I've been around a while, so I can reflect and look back on those very, very, very different times. In fact, my interview for the job as a woodcarver was held in Colnaghi because Wiggins was already owned by Jacob Rothschild, who owned Colnaghi, and had because of his great interest in the arts, I think it was fascinating for him to be involved and own those companies. So my interview was at the old Colnaghi premises in Bond Street. So I remember those sort of, red damask walls and the old master pictures hanging on them. And I was this, art student in there. So it was kind of overwhelming in a way. So we had, and I guess Jacob wanted to own Wiggins because there was seen to be probably, I guess, a synergy between, the frame world, the frame business, and the art market, and because frames and framing are this wonderful intersection between decorative arts and paintings and how we display them and connoisseurship and collecting and things like that. So it really, and you know, and he was a great connoisseur and he was a great collector as well. So I think he was enticing. Also, there was this myth around Wiggins as well. The myth, it was a reality in a way, that back in the 40s, in the interwar years, I think, Wiggins amassed this great collection of antique frames. They come into frames a little bit from the early 20th century as craftsmen making furniture, making Chippendale furniture, reproduction of a very high quality and very bespoke, you know. But that's how they came into it. I think in the interwar years, they became involved with picture frames more, but there were not frame sales, I think, in those days. There were picture sales, but there was many picture sales each week. You know, Sotheby's and Christie's and Bonhams and Phillips and, you know, 3 auction houses each and sales every week. So they would view those sales and mark each picture for the value of the frame, not for the value of the picture. And these pictures were, you know, Italian Baroque pictures were deeply, deeply unfashionable at the time. So Wiggins amassed the collection of frames, and when I joined the company, we had a warehouse full of 3,000 frames, and then on the top floor, which was locked and separate part of the business, was you know, whatever the paintings that came out of the frames. So there was this myth that the paintings were all by Van Dyck and Rubens and Rembrandt and all masterpieces, because they were quite secretive, and they left the pictures. They never dealt with the pictures. So there was this little bit of a myth about it. So that was also enticed people to be, you know, like Jacob, to be interested in Wiggins. Yeah. But anyway, we dealt with the frames, and yeah.
That is so interesting. And were there any masterpieces, or?
I think in the end, I don't think there were, and I think they were workshop and school of and this and that, the other. But you know, they all had frames, and sometimes, you know, you don't have to have a great painting to have a great frame. Sometimes, as we know, there's workshop and whatever, and they hang in great collections, and they given great frames. So the frames were of interest. So the art market, you know, we framed for Colnaghi and you know, the other dealers in the West End, of which there were many, and internationally, and museums and private collectors. But in those days, then I moved from the bench working so I came into Wiggins as a carver because I guess the workshop was transitioning from being an old family firm with, you know, getting a little bit older, and they wanted some new blood, and to get through this volume of work. And I remember the workshop stacked with frames that were behind schedule and pieces stuck on, and they needed carving and, you know, whatever. So I came in at that point and worked on the bench with Jim Wiggins, who was this great wood carver and had the royal warrant to Her Majesty the Queen and the Queen Mother at the time. And so I continued my learning with him, and he was here on the bench and I was there on the bench, and he was extremely tough master. You know, he was quite Victorian in values and the way he taught and things. So that was fantastic for me. It was a great opportunity. And then I guess I rebuilt the workshop, and we had up to 20 craftsmen at one point. Wow. You know, which was, you know, 3 joiners and 4 wood carvers and, you know, 8 gilders and a mount maker, and, you know, and the great thing then is with a workshop of that size, it's not the size so much, it's the pool of talents that you have, that you can all learn from each other and collaborate on things, which isn't really the way every workshop runs. That sometimes they had a head person and he dictated everything and did the toning and the finishing. I really wanted more collaborative, so people could learn and grow in their skills. So but the art market was such that you could sustain a workshop because there was a volume of work. You know, there was a Colnaghi exhibition of Italian Baroque pictures, and they were, you know, 2 meters by 3 meters, and they were, you know, or whatever, they were big, and like Preti and, you know, with these great masters. And we would have to turn these frames down. They would have 6 or 10 exhibitions a year, you know, and so you had this throughput of work, and you produce sort of a quality as well. And sometimes it was adapting antique frames and restoring things, but it was making reproductions. But we always, you know, one of the things I remember working with Jim is, well, if maybe the client doesn't have the budget for this, then you make the same frame of the same quality, you just put less cuts in it. So, if it doesn't have the money, well, we're not going to carve the back edge. Let's not carve the back edge. It's in less hours, so it's less money. You know, you don't say, well, let's make it cheaper.
Yeah.
You don't, let's cut quality. And I remember that had probably been a previous discussion, because when I started running the workshop, there was a carving machine, like a pentagraph, where you could make more copies of things. And I think I very quickly said, no, we can't touch this. So I think I virtually gave the machine away to someone else. It had cost a lot of money, because I said, I don't want to go down that route. We don't want to compromise quality. And there are other businesses which are to be respected, that make things, you know, quicker and cheaper and things. But for me and for Wiggins, that wasn't the route. It was no, we maintain a quality and a standard, which means then you tend to have the best clients and the best pictures. But it was that. So I think from the outset there was that, and I guess I had also learned that was part of continuing the tradition of quality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Incredible. Well, we mentioned quality, gilding and carving, and of course we're here in Wiggins store and workshop. We're surrounded by beautiful frames. When someone looks at a frame, maybe for the first time, what would you tell them to look at first? What should they notice first?
What should they notice? Should I pick up a prop? Let's pick up a prop. I call them my toys. Which you know, I get out of my toy cupboard. So the great thing is about these frames, it's like a library in a way. They're reference models. They're things that, you know, and then you can pick them up and you can talk about them. So I think it's what to notice about a frame. It's I guess it's like anything in life. You want to look at things closely and understand them, you know. So if you immediately look at the surface and say, wow, isn't it beautiful, it slightly misses the point. You want to so I like to turn it over and have a look. So the frame's made in oak, so we can say, oh, okay, that's interesting. It's mitered and it's keyed here. So we have this spline, this key, which is beveled at an angle here. It's tapered here, and it's bashed in from here with some Scotch glue, animal glue, and it pulls the frame together and holds it together. So because we know that it's in oak, we say, well, it's probably French, because the French were working with oak. So immediately we're starting to understand. When it's keyed like this, well, it's probably 18th century. Has a really nice little arris, a little bevel on the back edge. So it's really nicely crafted. So I picked this up because it's a small frame, but it's a really delicious frame. So already we're saying, well, because of the materials and things, it's French. And then we look at the section, the shape of the frame, not getting involved with the ornament immediately. And we have this, which is an OG section. And so because this is an OG, it's like a hump and a hollow like this section, we know, well, we've moved really out of the 17th century, because this section we're into the 18th century. And then we've got the little flat, which is sanded, and this is really another OG here. And the back hollow. So we said, well, now we can begin to say, well, this is the date of the frame. We're into the 18th century, and then we can look at the ornament, which is carved in oak, which is quite a tough wood to carve. It doesn't hold the detail particularly well. But with the French frames, they are thickly gessoed and then recut in the gesso with a repareur with hooks. He pulls rather than pushes to redefine the detail of the ornament, you know, so that here in the little flowers, there's little cuts here, and then the background is cross-hatched and punched, and that pushes the carving forward and, helps articulate the ornament. And then we've got the red clay coming through. And you've got a texture here. You have sand put into the wet gesso. So when they put on the clay, well, the clay is really quite red and quite dark. So again, that's very French. So we can identify, where the frame's from, also by the colour of the clay and the type of the gilding. And it's a mixture of burnished and matte gold. The top areas are burnished here, and then the backgrounds are left rather matte, and they've got this texture from the recutting in the gesso. So now we know a little bit about it, and we know where it's from and what date, and then it becomes useful, because then you can start to say, okay, so what can we put in it? L'Ancre, or maybe a Votto, or maybe a Renoir, because these old frames were used on Impressionist pictures as well. Renoir liked to use antique frames. I guess it lent him, this idea of coming from a long tradition of painters. So really handling it, looking at it, turning it over, getting to understand it, and then the frame becomes useful.
And when a client comes to you, for example, with a painting and without an original frame, without a frame, we can even go into this idea of an original frame, and if that's, there is such a thing, how would you then go about finding the right frame for said painting? I mean, is it then more the sort of materiality of the frame itself? Is it more historical research linked to either the painting or the frame, or the relationship between the two? Is it value? What's the process to essentially assign, shall we say, a frame to a work?
Yeah, assign, and indeed, lead the client through the conversation, because well, as you know, part of, I think, the fun about working in the commercial art world, being dealers, is we're not just selling, we're also educating, because if you don't have, that's what I've always felt with frames, if you're not having that partnership between education and commerce, the commerce doesn't work in a way, and that's why we work with museums and things as well. We like that, and it's sort of that partnership. So you have to, in a way, bring the client with you on the journey onto framing something. So I guess I would start first by seeing what frame is already on the picture, because it may be that there's something there to save. They may say, I want to reframe the picture, but you say, well, what's it in already? And is there any merit in what's already on the picture? So here I'm already a very bad salesman, because we might be keeping your frame. But so I think, but that's important, to kind of give good, what you're selling in a way always is good advice. It's not so is there something worth keeping? Maybe it's a later frame, maybe it's not the date of the painting, but maybe it's got some connection with the history of the picture. And I particularly feel that with museums. But and then if not, then it needs reframing. Then you want to answer. So we then start with the painting. Well, who's the artist, and where was he working, and what is the date of the picture, and so those things. Then you have okay, so this is nudging us in the direction that it's 17th century, and it comes from Bologna and whatever, and then you start to say, well, okay, so now we can think of frames that could be historically appropriate for it, and I guess I also want to know something, about the client, where they're going to hang it, what their taste is, what other pictures they might have, what sort of collector they are, and then you can appeal to that sort of sensibility with the things that you offer as well.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be that it's an Italian picture, but an artist who's widely collected in England, and you can offer an English frame. Mm-hmm. I always like English frames. I have a soft spot for those. But so that's the starting point. what's on the picture, is there any merit in it? Do we save it? Do we restore it? And then what about the painting? Where's it from? And then we start with historically appropriate frames.
And is there such a thing as, I'm being voluntarily facetious here, but is there such a thing as, so for example, if this is an 18th century French frame, would you ever, consider framing, I don't know, a contemporary or late 20th century painting in an 18th century frame? I don't know, late 20th century Italian painting in an 18th century French frame? How much of it is historical and how much of it is purely aesthetic and visual?
That's the other fun bit I think about frames, is that there's they're aesthetic. There's an aesthetic value in that marriage that you make between painting and frame, and there's that sort of serendipitous selection that they almost choose each other. It's like a dating agency in a sense. You just introduce and that seems to work, but it's never quite like that. You always come from some historical perspective, but it's interesting with putting earlier frames on contemporary pictures, 20th century pictures, and I think I have stories where I was buying frames in Paris, in the 80s and the 90s, and I would like artist frames, and I would buy artist frames. I think I'll pick up another prop. This is what we call a Degas frame from the end of the 19th century or the turn of the century, 1900 or so, and we know that Degas. We now know, but probably in my early career, nobody cared, but Degas designed his own frames. And back in the 1880s in his sketchbooks, and we have these coxcomb patterns that he did, which this is similar to. And he put because they were against the Baroque gilded, elaborate frames. That was part of their statement. They were against that bourgeois taste, so they wanted frames to match as well their taste. So they exhibited pictures in painted frames, white frames, green frames. So I was buying these, but if I showed them to a client, they would say, my paintings by Degas, I don't think you understand. I just paid some millions for this, and whatever you put it this, it's not. And they would want this, because it looks expensive, and so the market's changed now, because now you will find people will say, well, and I framed a number of Degas for museums and that. Back into white artist frames. So in a sense that has been, I think, some re-education by, the market and museums. Musée d'Orsay did a book then on a catalogue on framing and Degas. So museums have taken up this and taken interest because they want to frame these things in a historically more accurate way, in a sense. So I think when you put Degas back into these frames, he then becomes a much more contemporary, edgy artist of his era. And so I think in a way, there's now a move to go away from the bourgeois frames. I don't think they're always wrong, but to go away from those and put him back in, because we have... we now have more contemporary artists in a way, so you want to place him contextually, historically, back in the late 19th century, and you're comparing with other artists at the time who are in, the regular gilded frames, and so we're showing him as being a very modernist artist. So I back to the thing, I like to present artist frames as one of the propositions, to clients. And they sometimes go down that route. I had one client who collected wonderful Narby pictures and things, and he gave his collection to a museum in the end. And I think it was a Bonnard he bought at one point, and I made suggestions of 19th century gilded frames and maybe an 18th century frame or whatever, and then a wooden frame, because I've always maintained an archive of picture frames, a computer database. So when I travel, or I'm always photographing and documenting, and I want to document that originality of what frames are original to pictures. And so I knew there was a Bonnard in this rather flat frame with a beveled sight edge in pine, and I thought, this is a Bonnard frame, and I have a frame like this. So I offered it to him, and he very politely came back and said, "Michael, thank you very much, but when I want a floorboard, I will go to a local timber yard." So he was not ready. He was not ready for the artist frame. But I think it's always good to slightly push and challenge taste, because in a way these are historic statements of taste, and history always challenges us more than we can challenge ourselves. You know, when we say, well, I want a more outrageous frame. Well, history is more outrageous normally than you can be yourself. So yeah.
I was just at the Courtauld Gallery with this amazing Seurat exhibition that they have now, and he used to paint his own frame with little dots.
Yes.
And that will play with the colors in the paintings. And some museums, there were some American museums, they decided to either display them in the original frame or make a reproduction of the original.
Yeah.
And I saw people's reaction in the gallery, and they didn't necessarily like it. They prefer the older frames, because I think they give an historicity. You know, they give some, I don't know, more grounding to the picture itself, rather than having, a mod, kind of like contemporary frame. But maybe he wanted the frame for the painting for which he designed it.
Yeah.
So it's also a moral choice sometimes, to go with the artist's choice or go with the public's choice.
Yeah.
And I think when those artists get involved in, painting the borders and making a frame, Van Gogh did that. We think we only have one surviving Van Gogh frame in the Van Gogh Museum. But, so then in a way it then becomes a little bit of a problem. With that one Van Gogh frame, do we then copy that frame and put it on all Van Goghs? Because I think it's quite dangerous doing this, because you then really are trying to reinterpret the artist, and if there's a section of a painting missing by an artist, you don't really replicate it or whatever. No. So I think that's
It's tricky. Yeah.
It's tricky. I framed the Irises, which was a world-beating price at auction for this painting by Van Gogh, and So I framed that, and it went in an Italian 17th century frame, a very simple moulding, silvered moulding. But there's some resonance between these antique frames and that the brushwork and in a way the spirit of a Van Gogh painting. And that is a route that collectors and museums have gone down in framing Van Gogh, because we only have the one Van Gogh painting in its original frame, which he painted, and the others he didn't frame because he didn't sell them. So you couldn't, but he had ideas on frames. We know that. So the Getty Museum then had the irises, and they said, "Oh, we don't like the frame that's on the picture." I said, "Well," and I knew them well. So they I remember they replicated painted white frames. The flat and with a beveled sight edge, which is like the one in the Van Gogh Museum, and apparently there was really violent reaction from the public. They didn't understand it, and replicating a white frame is if you're not careful, it becomes like household paint, and it's very harsh up against it. So they went through various iterations of this, and then they came back to me and we reframed the picture, and in another silver frame, slightly narrower, and so it is about. So the public can have really quite strong reactions, probably more about the frame than about the painting, in a sense, but because everybody can slightly get involved in taste, taste of the frame. So they were really passionate about this. So then they went back and reframed it. Yeah.
And artists as well. I mean, the case of Pre-Raphaelites not liking particularly Victorian frames, and then the case of Flaming June that you reframed.
Yes.
How was that story? Because he wanted a specific frame for it, right? The artist.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Well, he designed his own frames and worked closely with his framer and had these sort of entablature tabernacle frames around his pictures, brightly gilded, which were in a way a statement of away from the traditional ornament in a way, and they echoed the subject matter of the pictures, that the Greek architecture and things, so Flaming June was interesting. So we were asked to frame that at the Leighton retrospective, whenever it was, in the early 90s at the RA. Yeah, it was the centenary of his birth or death. So a major exhibition, and Flaming June really had not been seen here since 1960, when it was sold, and it's quite unbelievable. It was in the most nasty, is the only word you could use, cheap reproduction, little rococo, spindly rococo frame. It was a really of no consequence. But you had this iconic painting, and but it shows you about taste, because and the story's there on our website. But the painting itself had fallen out of fashion so quickly. So it was discovered in the late 50s, boarded up behind a fireplace in South London, because the painting was presumably regarded as so awful and so out of fashion, out of taste. So when it was discovered, they sold it or whatever, and the frame was taken off, which was big and grand and columns and gilded, and so it would appear to have some value in a sense. And the painting was sold separately, and the frame, I think, was £60 and the painting was £50. So the frame was lost, it's separated. I mean, I guess it's still there somewhere. I don't think someone would have put it in a skip, it looks like something. It's there somewhere. But so we then had to replicate the frame, and there was another picture by Leighton on the market at the time of the same pattern, because we have photographs of his studio with that painting in the frame. So we knew what it should have, and then we were able to take casts of the ornament and replicate the ornament and do a section drawing and replicate the thing exactly, and then it was exhibited, and now the painting has been back several times at auction, at exhibition in New York as well. Yeah. But and I remember the little oil sketch for it came up at auction, I think from the Leverhulme collection, and there was a great collector of Victorian pictures, John Schaefer, and I used to work with him, so I encouraged him to buy this, and it had the original little Watts frame on it, and it's a small picture, but it had this wide, with I think a Ford and Dickinson label on the back, and it got lent to some exhibitions and things, and then I think it was sold again or whatever, and then I got a phone call from someone saying, could you find a frame for this picture? And I'd photographed it and documented, put it in my archive. I said, well, but it has the original frame by Ford and Dickinson. I mean, you know, he said, no, it's just a little narrow slip around it. So I was able to send them an image. No, this is the frame. So then they went back into the basement or wherever it was, and of course the frame had been taken off for photography or whatever, and just left there, and they wanted it. So we were able to then put the frame back on, and I think that picture is now, it's at Leighton House, I think. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So in a way, you need to document frames to protect them. Yeah. Otherwise, they can. Yeah.
So important. And maybe we can go on about provenance.
Exactly, because actually that links very well to, and also links to what you were saying earlier about how you keep an archive of your frames and track of them, let's say. Because I find, obviously, very often, we talk about the provenance of paintings and their histories and where they come from, but less so about the provenance of the frames. Why and how is the provenance of a frame, important or relevant? Is it relevant in relationship to the painting? Is it relevant in its own right? Or are there sometimes dialogue between the two, would you say?
Yeah, it's a fascinating subject. The idea of provenance. Look, here we're sat in amongst all of these frames, and you really have to ask the question: how come there's so many frames? And these are all empty. By and large, these are all probably unadapted. The original size, the original. We can see it's got the original key. It's never been adapted. It's the original frame, and it's the same for this and this. And this. So, what happened to the paintings? And because frames are fashion in a way, collectors buying paintings, grand tour artists from England travelling in through the Low Countries down to Rome on the grand tour, they will buy pictures and then they will bring them back, and they will want to display them in the latest taste, in the latest fashion. So they will take off whatever frame's on it, and they will reframe the painting in the latest taste. So frames exactly are part of the provenance of painting, because they document that owner and their taste and that moment in history when they were acquiring these works of art. And so this is a little bit of a favourite subject of mine. I've just come back from a frame conference symposium in of all places, Hobart, Tasmania, and I was giving a paper on exactly the subject. That, in a sense, almost a problem with museums is that they teach art history in a chronological way, in this didactic, formulaic way, that you start with the early Renaissance galleries, and then the Italian, and then you have the Northern Renaissance, and then you move on into the Baroque, and you move through. And it's the picture frame that's out of kilter with this, because it may be a collector's frame on a Dutch picture from the 18th century and the picture's from 1620, and they say, oh yeah, but we're teaching, this room's about Dutch paintings, and so we want everything in a black frame, and because that's what Dutch frames by and large are, black ebony frame. And so the frame, the collector's frame, that reminder of the provenance of the painting gets removed. And then, because of budgetary reasons and things, if you're not careful, it becomes a reproduction frame goes on it. But that suits the footpath that they're taking you through art history. So I like to slightly challenge that. So no, but the frame is the provenance. And we don't know that we're always going to teach art history in that way. We know in museums now, the way they teach art history, it's not always about qualitative, aspects of the painting. This is a better Rubens than that, and this, it's not. It's about the narrative as well. It's about the subject. It's about that time and place of when it was painted, and the subject that the artist chose. And these tell really important stories, and we see those changes in museums now, and what the pictures they want to buy by female artists and things, which is great. They're stories that were probably not addressed so much. So I'll pick up another prop if I can. So this is what we call a Palladian frame, or a Kent frame. So it's English, 1735, 1740. So it's the same time that you have Rococo frames, which are quite a different animal. So this is really quite architectural. William Kent had travelled on the Grand Tour and was influenced by Palladio architecture. So this represents that, with these outset corners, the architectural egg and dart ornament, the sanded frieze. So it's a very particular style of framing. But one of the things I gave in the talk was a frame of this pattern, which I discovered in Detroit, that was stripped of its gilding down to the pine. And this is some years ago. And with the curator, we said, well, what is it? And I said, well, this is a Kent frame made for the picture. And we looked at this. It's part of the Duke of Leeds collection. And he bought, I think, 5 Canalettos on his grand tour, and and the pair of great Canalettos are from the Duke of Leeds are in the National Gallery in frames of this pattern. They've actually got a Greek key ornament in here. So I said, this is part of that suite of paintings, and there's another frame also stripped of pine, back to the pine, that's in the Fogg Art Museum of the same pattern. It's also Duke of Leeds. So you're part of the Leeds collection. So you want to keep those and restore them, because that really identifies these pictures as part of the Duke of Leeds. But we know that Consul Smith was, the merchant for Canaletto, and had his house full of Canalettos hung, but he put them in narrow Venetian panel frames because he had to hang the walls tight with these pictures to sell them. And so do you say, well, we take this off and we put it in a Venetian panel frame because that's closer to what to, but there is that taste, and you get museums saying, no, I want a Venetian panel frame, but actually Canaletto was a Grand Tour artist, and a lot of the pictures ended up in England. Well, actually, there's another story, Canaletto, when he painted in London, he lodged in, I think, Silver Street in Soho with his frame maker, which was Wiggins, or Big Arms.
Wow.
We don't know exactly it's the same Wiggins. We can only get the history back to late 19th century, but anyway, it's tantalising that Canaletto stayed with his frame maker Wiggins. So frames really are absolutely part of the provenance, and our historic museum, the Fitzwilliam Museum and the Ashmolean Museum, they have great English frames on Dutch old masters and Italian old masters, and in a way you don't want to change those, because it tells you the whole history of Fitzwilliam buying these pictures and his grandfather collecting in the late 17th century, early 18th century, and framing them in the best quality in English taste of the time.
Well, we love these stories, and I would like to ask you about two other stories, or whichever you would like to tell, both of them. One about the Blue Boy, Gainsborough, and the one about the Rembrandt, the two circles. Which one would you like to tell us?
Well, Blue Boy is such an iconic painting, and we recently had it.
The most expensive painting.
The most expensive painting at the time, yeah, absolutely, and it was sold in 21, wasn't it? 1921, and then came back. The only time I think it's travelled.
For the National Gallery.
For the National Gallery, brought it back in 2021 for the centenary of it being sold. And when it was sold for a record price, it was exhibited at the National Gallery. And I think the director at the time wanted to keep it. But I think he wrote on the back of it, farewell, or whatever on the back. So it was sort of a beautiful story that it came back. But the Huntington, so Devine sold it to Henry Huntington, and it's now in the Huntington Museum in California. And I'd always visited them. It's such a wonderful collection. And the picture hangs in the main gallery, along with all those other great portraits, Reynolds and Rumley and things. And so the museum approached me because they felt that the picture, being so iconic, it didn't, by its framing, stand out from the other full-length portraits in the gallery. It didn't sort of make a step. And they said, so this is really nuancing pictures with the framing. It didn't look bad, but they really said, but this is the Blue Boy. We need to just slightly move it up a percentage point in the framing. And they thought about it deeply, and I worked with them. And in a way, you have to, because it's a museum collection, they said, well, we have a responsibility to the picture and the frame. So are we allowed to reframe it? And the framing of the picture had been contentious for many years before. When it was in a 19th century frame, and they pulled up records, and we've got black and white photographic records of it back in the 40s or 50s. And there was a public outcry then that the public didn't like the frame. So it's not the first time that the framing was questioned. So at that time, they took that 19th century frame off the picture, and they had a frame in the basement that was a frame that Devine had used on another picture. And they cut that down and put it on the painting back in the, at that time, not the 1950s, whatever. So it was not an original framing. And the other frames in that gallery are often by Devine. And Devine was sensitive to framing, and he spent a lot of money on framing, and they were very fancy, very grand, very Louis frames, made really for the American market to make the pictures look expensive and sell them well. So, but this picture didn't have that. It had kept this 19th century English frame. So they said, well, we do have license to reframe it because it's not an original frame. It's not. It's one we found in the basement and we put it on. So we do have a license. So then we scouted around and we put it in a very grand Rococo frame. It is slightly earlier than the picture, and we adapted that and put it on, and it looks great. And that's how it came back from America. And as you know, Blue Boy is a very Van Dykean period. Gainsborough, the blue coat and things. Interestingly, this Rococo frame I'd bought 20, 30 years earlier, and it had come off of Van Dyke.
Wow.
And I think we reframe. I can't remember this, or we reframed the Van Dyke, and or I don't know whether we have, but we bought this frame. We knew it had come off of Van Dyke, and it hadn't been adapted, and someone then wants to reframe the Van Dyke in a earlier 17th century frame. So in a way, it was a Van Dyke frame going on a Van Dyke in Gainsborough. It was, and it now looks and it stands out in the gallery. And so it's a matter of just tweaking an iconic picture, and just improving it through the framing.
Yeah, and you were talking about this idea of responsibility and contention, and I think that's a really interesting topic when it comes to frames, because framing is at an interesting sort of crossroads often between scholarship and between, craft and the market, of course. And are there instances, do you find, where these different priorities, sort of pull in different directions at times, or is it an even relationship, so we say, between the materiality, the craft question, and then the sort of other realities, shall we say?
Yeah, I think in the museum context, I think really, I think that conversation has to begin with museums properly cataloguing what they have, because then when they know what they have on a painting, back to that question: is it of worth? Does it document a moment that's important in the picture's history when it was collected? Then that prompts the question: should we be retaining it? Should we be reframing it? And then you've got qualitative issues. Does the quality of the picture, is it reflected in the quality of the frame? And so you need to examine all of those things first, and then you can come to the point. So okay, this is a project for reframing, and then it's back to looking at the frame. You want to look at the frame and the quality and examining those things, and can you make a marriage between this painting and the frame? And I think in as we know, we're trying to defend in the art market and in the museum world. We're trying to slow the world down a little bit, where everything is an image on a screen and we flick across it and it's all on TikTok and it's a very frenetic world. And in a way, the art world slows this down, and we want to spend some time looking at an image, looking at a picture. And it's the frame that grabs that attention, that helps you slow that down, grabs the attention and focuses on the picture. So I think it is challenging in the world to get people to look at something and say, oh, I see that, yeah, that's quality, because everything moves. They want to swipe to the next image, and so we want to say, well, no, let's look at the quality of this, let's stop for a minute, and I think if you put quality of a frame around a picture, it grabs attention, and I think we that's part of our role. I think is defending quality and trying to get people interested in stopping and looking.
Yeah.
And we're living, as you said, in this fast-paced world. And have you noticed an interest coming back towards craft and materiality in the public, especially in your industry in framing? Like, do you have people getting more and more curious about your job, your craft?
I think when people come in, and we're not so much shopkeepers any longer. Sadly, I think the footfall is less and things. So it's emails and sending images and things, and that's harder to grab people's attention. But when you do, they love it. As I say, I've just been to Hobart, to an international symposium on picture frames, and there was a curator from the Louvre and the Rijksmuseum, and so there was very good people there talking in a way, and they were the Louvre and the Rijksmuseum talking about cataloguing their extensive collection of frames and the 3,000 frames empty, and then the frames on the pictures, and discussing the concept of framing and reframing, and what do we do, and there was other people talking about conservation and restoring frames and those aspects of craftsmanship that we protect, and we try and continue those skills. But I think with less volume in the market, then there's less need for the skills, and if we're not careful, those skills kind of disappear. But there was also a talk by this young undergraduate from American University there, talking about mapping of frames. She studied architecture actually, but with an app on your phone that images them, and then you can takes a contour map of them, and then you can press a button and you can print them. So that you think, well, what has this got to do with Cennino Cennini and gilding and and what has got to do? But this is another generation, and maybe we won't have people like me who craftsmen, but maybe in time to come they won't. So they will be looking at these things and understanding them in a different way using new technology, and this has its own importance, that you can use this information to understand objects, maybe replicate them because it's too fragile to travel. So you put the copy on, and it travels for an exhibition. Because sometimes the frame is more fragile than the Louvre. I think often doesn't send the frames on exhibition.
And do you think there's a renewed interest by young collectors as well into frames and framing?
I've been encouraged by some that yes, there is. I mean, we know we've been through this era. Maybe we're still a little bit in it of modernism and minimalism and whatever. But I think that we're coming a little bit out of that, and people aren't too embarrassed to say, well, we quite like the decorative arts, So I have collectors who buy works of art, and they're really, really interested in the framing and that whole aspect, So we these are fashions. We know that William Rubin, who was the curator of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, he took all the frames off the Van Goghs and Cézannes and Impressionist pictures and modern pictures in the early 80s, and called them no more than eye-catching fluff. And then the pictures were rather, in my view, dreadfully displayed. They were just stuck on the wall, rather like postage stamps. And then they slightly compromised, and they put flat gilded borders around them, not even quite frames. and then they looked rather like the reproductions they were selling in the shop. You couldn't quite tell the difference between the two. And so these things are, I think that was really rather an unthought out, process. And there have been in Genoa, I think in the Piazza Bianco, back in the mid-20th century, took a rather modernist approach to the installation of their collection. And there are pictures hung on the wall, I think slate walls and suspended and things. And, it's a point, and I think maybe some of these pictures they were early gold ground pictures and things, they didn't have frames and it was an idea, but that was really a thought out interior minimalist approach. So we know that there are changes in fashion and taste and the way you hang pictures or the colour you paint the gallery walls in the National Gallery or whatever, and but the frame I think is always important. Should always it's that point where it introduces the painting to the public and it tells you something about a context that was previous, and it gives you this introduction to the picture.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one last final question, and that would be, if you could correct one widespread misconception about frames to our public, what would that be? Like a stereotype, or I don't know.
I get it. It's frames and money, isn't it? Money is always that. It always comes into the equation, and it's always a problem in a way. Frames are expensive. Why does it cost so much? But I think frames were always a major investment, and collectors in the 17th century, the 18th century, they spent considerable energy and effort on this frame sat here behind me is a great Florentine 17th century Baroque frame of the style that Leopoldo de' Medici used for reframing his entire collection. So he went to great expense to do this, and it's not really about the money. It's about the quality. It's back to the quality, and he wanted quality. He wanted to make a statement that I am important. I have wealth. I have taste, and I want to make that statement with my collection. So really, it's the same with frames. And somehow, if you're not careful, people say, "Why can't I have this more quickly for less?" And you can't. So but that's where you go back and you say, well, pick up the object, let's look at it and let's see the quality. Let's look at this, and this doesn't come quickly, and it comes with time costs money, and so it's getting the client back engaged in looking at the object, and then they say, well, I'm not surprised. I have to make an effort to own this and keep it.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great tip for all the collectors that are following us. I think the collecting journey doesn't stop when you buy the painting, that there's some restoration to do, there's some reframing to do, and that's part of it. And, there should be budget not only for buying the piece, but also for all of these other steps, which is good.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Michael. Thank you very much for being with us as well. And thank you everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and see you in the next episode of Colnaghi Talks.
Thank you.